Good morning and welcome to the show. I'm Jonathan Ruis and I'll be your moderator. I'm a partner here at RBT CPAs and a former Sullivan County legislator serving as chairman of the Finance Committee, vice chair, and chairman of the board. I'm joined by Jen George, a partner with RBT. She serves as our director of compliance and our technical guru. Also with us is Linda Hannigan, a director with the firm. She has nearly 30 years of experience serving municipalities in the Valley in just about every capacity imaginable. I just wanted to start today's show with a brief recap of last week's kickoff show. Jen and Linda provided a great overview of the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and the various amounts of funding allotted to the entitlement units, states, counties, and metropolitan cities, and the amounts allocated to non-entitlement units, our towns and villages. The federal portal for entitlement units is open. However, New York State has not solidified a process for the non-entitlement units. So if you've been searching and come up empty, rest easy, you're not missing anything. Jen and Linda emphasized the need to plan to maximize the benefits of the ARPA funds. While there's discretion on how the funds can be utilized, the general areas of use are outlined in the Act. More to come on that shortly. Just a reminder, last week's show is available on the RBT website at www.rbtcpas.com. We plan to run the show for the next few weeks and beyond if necessary to bring the latest and greatest developments around ARPA. For the first 30 minutes of today's show, we'll delve into the eligible uses and areas not eligible, the reporting requirements as we know them now, and some items that you should be focusing on. We'll wrap up with 15 minutes of Q&A, so please use the chat function to submit your questions. To get things started, Jen, can these funds be used for any project a municipality can come up with?
Well, the short answer is no, but a longer answer is it depends. Yeah, there's some things that are definitely not allowed. There's some things that are definitely allowed. And then there's some gray framework. So let's go into a few of the things that are specifically allowed within the Act. One of the things is supporting public health expenditures. Obviously, we're still trying to get everyone vaccinated. We're still doing testing. And although the pandemic has receded, and we just got the great news from New York that we are at 70% vaccination level. And so New York has lifted pretty much all of the restrictions, which is wonderful. But there's still work to be done. And so the funds can be used for such things as vaccination programs and medical expenses, testing. If you are doing enforcing public health orders, fortunately, we don't have many of those left. But if somebody was to try to go to an airport and refuse to wear a mask, that's still under public health orders that you have to. So you could use the funds to help enforce that. If you're doing capital investments in public facilities to specifically meet pandemic needs. So it's not just we're doing capital investments, but it has to ultimately come back to, is it addressing these pandemic needs? Some of the other things that you can use it for is behavioral health care needs. The pandemic exacerbated a lot of things. I mean, people with substance abuse issues who were locked in their houses, that was not a good thing. Also people with mental health issues. So if you are using it for services that help to address those types of things, that's definitely an allowable item. Crisis intervention, hotlines. And then some of the other things are payroll and covered benefits for public health care, human services, public safety, those types of things. The payroll is allowable as long as it's specifically for the COVID response. So if you have, say, an administrator who is part-time in the field and part-time in the office, you can't use it for all of their payroll. It's only specifically for the part of their time that they are in the field doing the COVID response. So that's some of the public health expenditures that are allowed.
So another section of the eligible expenses are the negative impact caused by the pandemic. So as Jen mentioned, the focus is on the what has been caused by the COVID-19. So this section is really, really broad. So it includes things like delivering assistance to families and workers, helping, providing aid to unemployed workers, as well as household facing food or housing or other financial insecurity. It's supporting small businesses where you can provide loans, grants, in-kind assistance and counseling programs to help businesses rebound from this downturn. One of the areas that's a big focus is industries that have been impacted by COVID-19, typically tourism, travel, and hospitality. Those industries have been particularly impacted, and aid can be directed to those industries. And lastly, rebuilding public sector capacity. And here we could use the funding for in building internal capacity to implement economic relief programs, loan programs that the government can offer, targeted outreach towards improving technology infrastructure. These topics that, as you can see, are very, very broad in their scope. And when considering whether you want to do that type of funding, you would want to make sure that your municipality had the infrastructure to provide these services. I really think, and perhaps Jennifer, you can agree with me, that these types of services are typically offered by states and counties rather than local municipalities, towns, and villages.
Yes, I would agree. And I don't, there's certain sectors of these available uses that I think are going to be more along the lines of what towns and villages and cities will be interested in. And then there's other areas that will be more state and county type services that they'll be providing.
Absolutely.
But one of the things that the Act does recognize is that governments spent a lot of money during the pandemic, and they also lost a lot of revenue during the pandemic. And one of the allowable uses is to replace lost public sector revenue, because we're trying to move forward and we're trying to make sure that the governments have the funds that they need to come out of this better than certainly where they are now. Now, there is a formula for how to calculate what this lost revenue is. And I'm not even going to read it to you. Last week, I read to you one of the formulas. I'm not going to read you this formula. It's available and you certainly have access to it. I'm just going to cover some of the key components that go into the calculation. Basically, what you're looking for is what was your base year revenue, and then multiply that by the growth factor and compare that to what your actual revenue was. When we talk about base year revenue, that is the last full fiscal year that you had prior to the pandemic starting. So prior to March 2020. So if you are a village in New York, you've got a May 31st year end, you would be looking at your May 31st, 2019 year as your base year. For towns with December 31st year ends, you would be looking at December 31st, 2019. If you had a June year end, it would be June 30, 2019. Basically, any year end prior to March 2020. That's going to be your base year. Then there is a growth adjustment, because the government assumes that you would actually be growing if we hadn't had the pandemic. Now, you have two options for the growth adjustment factor to use. One is you could use your own average annual revenue growth over the last 3 full fiscal years, or you could use a stated factor that they've given, which is 4.1%, whichever one is greater. So if you are a municipality where you've kept your budget pretty stable, maybe the 4.1 is going to be the easier way to go. So that's your two options. You take your base year revenue, multiply it by this growth factor, and then you compare it to the actual revenues. And the actual revenues are during the 12-month period ending on each calculation date.
Wow, that sounds easy to calculate.
Because they allow you to calculate it at different times. You can calculate it at December 31st, 2020, 21, 22, and 23. So if you have a December 31st year end, that's great. If you don't, that could be a little bit more complicated. So this is an area where we are anticipating that people are going to have lots of questions and maybe needing some assistance, which if you need any assistance, please reach out to us. We're happy to help. But it's, I would say this is also the area that has the most leeway, wiggle room, because once you say we're replacing lost revenue, there isn't as many restrictions on what you can do with the money going forward, because you're replacing stuff you've lost that you needed for government services. So this is an area where I would really hope that everybody focuses on and tries to maximize the use of this, because again, there's fewer strings attached. One of the other areas, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions about this, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the end, but we're just trying to keep going on the eligible uses, things that they have specifically stated are allowed, is providing premium pay for essential workers. And essential workers don't have to just be employees of the government. You have essential workers that were in many different areas, such as the folks that were working at the grocery stores. And they had to be in there, you know, interacting with the public. Otherwise, we would have all starved, because Amazon can't deliver everything, right? I think Amazon was at my house multiple times every day, but they still didn't bring me all my food. So you've got grocery store workers, obviously public health workers, janitors and sanitation workers. I mean, they were working a lot trying to keep everything clean. Even truck drivers, warehouse workers, all these people that they had to physically be there doing their jobs. Otherwise, you know, everything would have just come apart. So the Act does allow for premium pay for these workers, basically to compensate them for the fact that they were really putting themselves out there for the rest of us. And the government can either do that directly. If it's a government worker, then the government can pay them premium pay directly, or they can make grants to private employers. So maybe to the grocery store that had these employees working. What the Act does stress, though, is that we need to prioritize lower wage workers. And if you are going to be providing premium pay to people in excess of 150% of the average annual wage, you have to specifically justify why you are going in and giving them premium pay. It's really geared towards those frontline workers who were not, you know, don't get paid that much. So that is another area that is allowed, specifically allowed under the Act. Now, Linda's going to talk to you about the last specifically allowable act, which I think is an area where many municipalities will truly, truly benefit from this act. So take it away, Linda.
Okay, yes, I agree. This is probably the area that most of our local municipalities will be able to utilize the funds. And that is, they allow investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And what that means is that with regard to water, that's either building or upgrading your facilities, and that includes your transmission facilities and distribution and storage systems. Your sewer, again, allowing you to construct sewage treatment plants manage and treat stormwater or what they are subsurface drainage water, facilitating water reuse, and maintaining your treatment plants. So this again is what most of our local municipalities do. They have water and sewer. Our towns have water and sewer districts. Villages have their own, and cities maintain their own water and sewer services. So here is an opportunity for local municipalities to upgrade those facilities, consider perhaps putting in efficiencies in terms of electrical use that will give you, not only save you the cost of debt service if you were to finance these types of infrastructure projects, but also hopefully provide for improvements, in lower operating costs in the future. We definitely feel that this is an area that, all of our local municipalities should look at. The other area that's included in the infrastructure is broadband. But broadband here is focused on areas that either are not served or are underserved, and it's not geared toward replacing your local suppliers in your area necessarily. It's more geared for, as I said, underserved areas, rural areas that don't have broadband or have what I'm going to say is poor service. So this is, again, something I think that local municipalities really should take a look at.
Yeah, they talk a lot about the last mile in the act, which is, kind of tying in those last areas of the underserved communities. And I think with all the development that's going on, there's going to be a lot of last miles that have to get addressed here sooner rather than later. So now that we have some clarity on those uses where we can use the money, what areas should our viewers be avoiding?
Well, one of the areas that's specifically spelled out in the Act is directly or indirectly offsetting a reduction in revenue due to tax cuts that would be enacted from March 3rd, 2021. Here again, I think this is in line with it. The focus is on the Act is to provide funding that's forward-looking rather than looking backwards. In this particular case, it only applies to states and local governments. But again, I think it's indicative of what the thought process is behind the actual Act. One of the other areas that's specifically noted as ineligible is making a, quote, deposit to a pension fund that's an extraordinary contribution. We're not talking about the ordinary contributions that one would make. That would be part of the benefits provided to ineligible salaries that are paid. So going back to what Jen was talking about earlier, when you're talking about that the Act can fund certain eligible salaries and benefits, we're not talking about the pension part of those benefits. Those benefits are eligible. Also, again, is debt service. This is also, debt service is actually paying for past costs. So you can understand why it is considered an ineligible cost under the Act because it's not forward-looking. We're not funding projects or impacts of COVID. Any of the debt service would have probably occurred prior to COVID, the pandemic. And lastly, there's another one, legal settlements or judgments. And they're, again, actions that were taken in the past, not related to COVID. So those items are specifically noted as ineligible in the Act.
And then there's a few other things that are specifically not allowed. One of them is deposits to rainy day funds or financial reserves. The idea, again, is that we're trying to reduce and improve things that were impacted by COVID. So setting aside money so that we have it in the case in the future. That's not allowed. We can't set up, you know, they don't say slush funds, but you know. You're also, go ahead, Linda.
I have just to say, I think that the idea is they want you to spend it.
Yes. Yes, exactly. They also, Linda talked about the infrastructure that is specifically allowed, and they have specifically said other infrastructure outside of water, sewer, broadband is specifically not an eligible use. We'll talk about some of the other ways that you could potentially do that, but in general, you can't go out and pave roads with this money. Unless, of course, you are replacing lost public sector revenue. And once you've said you're replacing it, then you could potentially use some of that money to pave roads. But again, if you're going to do that, you need to make sure you're documenting really well. The last thing that is specifically ineligible is using this money as a matching fund for another federal program. So if you get federal money through a grant and you're required to, you know, they're going to pay 50% of the cost, you have to pay 50% of the cost, you can't use this money to match the federal money, you know, because then essentially the federal government would be paying for the whole thing, not just half.
Even so, Jen, that means even if the federal program is funding an ineligible project, it still can't be used. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're not allowed to use it to match.
Yeah.
But you could use it to match other money. So if you were getting a state grant that required a match, you could use it for that.
Sorry for the little light show. Energy conservation program. The lights clicked off on me. That certainly is a lot to digest and a lot of detail in there. And as you mentioned last week, there's going to be some serious oversight when it comes to substantiating that the money was spent properly, as you might imagine. What should our audience be thinking about when it comes to record keeping and documenting?
Well, first, obviously, one we want to keep records as to how you determine what was your eligible expenses. You know, obviously, New York municipalities are accustomed to keeping documentation of all their expenditures and following their procurement policies. So I think in that particular area, it's not anything new to our local municipalities. What do you think, Jen?
I think the key thing here is going to be documentation. If you are trying to do something that's a little creative, which is fine, because the eligible uses that they have listed are not exhaustive. You can use it for other things as long as it's not on the ineligible list. But you need to be prepared to document your rationale and why you thought that that was an allowable use. So, but definitely having support and documentation, because as we talked about last week, when they come back to you a year or 2 years later, you need to make sure that you can remember why you made the decisions that you made.
And we're still not 100% clear on the single audit application here. Have they clarified that, or?
Still no clarification on that. If the indications are that this money will be considered a federal program that is subject to a what we call a single audit, also a uniform guidance audit. Those of you who have had single audits in the past know that it's a rather intensive process, but it is really essentially a compliance test, because when you get federal money, and this applies no matter whether you are subject to single audit or not, all of this money is coming with compliance requirements, and you need to make sure that you're following them. It's not, there are definitely strings attached. So what a single audit does is it's in conjunction with your financial statement audit, and the auditors are looking at the different compliance requirements and did you actually comply with those requirements, but also did you have controls in place, internal controls, to make sure that you comply with those. And just for your information, if you expend $750,000 or more of federal money during a single fiscal year, then you are subject to one of these audits. Now, for municipalities who maybe have not had to be audited in the past, this will impose quite an additional cost, because it's not just having this compliance audit done, you also have to have a financial statement audit done. So we are still waiting. Again, we're waiting to hear from New York how you apply. We're waiting to hear from the federal government whether or not this money will be subject to single audit. As soon as we have answers, we will let you know. And if it does turn out that it is subject to single audit, that will be a whole show unto itself of what that means for all of you.
Yeah, and so even though these non-entitlement units are getting the money via New York State, it's passed through, so it's considered federal funds because that's the original source.
Actually, the money that's going to the NEUs it's actually federal, but beyond that, it's actually considered direct, even though it's making a pit stop at New York. Really, New York has has very limited discretion. It is considered a direct funding, just similar to the way that the cities and the counties and the states are getting direct funding. This is still going to be considered direct.
Great. So again, we touched on this a few times that New York State still is working on the entitlement units and on the process of how they're going to access their funds. But we have a few minutes here. Maybe we can spend some time on what should they be doing until New York State gets the process figured out.
Well, Jonathan, I think one of the things they should first look at is the checklist that Treasury has published for the NEUs. And in that checklist, there's some basic information they should be getting, but also they should be taking a look at their budget and determining whether determining what their allocation is, and two, determining whether that allocation fits with the budget limits that are stated. And that, just so you know, that budget includes all of their operating funds. It's not just your general fund when you do this calculation. So that's something that the NEUs, the non-entitlement units, can do right away. There's also the sample award terms and conditions agreements. They should take a look at that and be comfortable with what's required. And lastly, also be aware of Title VI in the Civil Rights Act. That's something that's specifically noted they have to comply with, that it's listed in the Act. So those are some things they can do right now until we hear from New York State.
Right. Also, again, we talked about this last week. You can estimate how much funding you're going to get. The population information is available on the Treasury website. So you need to have an idea. You're probably not going to be able to calculate it to the dollar, but at least a ballpark idea of how much funding you're going to be receiving, because that will help to come up with a plan. There's a big difference between if you're getting $1 million or $10 million, what you can actually do. You can also calculate your lost revenue numbers now, because you're going to be using probably December 31st, 2020 numbers. So you can go ahead and make that calculation so that you know how much of the funding that you're getting you can put towards that. And again, some of these calculations are kind of involved, and so please reach out, use professional resources like us. Shameless plug, reach out to us. We're happy to help. And yeah, so keep that in mind. Some of these things you can do now, but then ultimately come up with a plan. So Linda, how do they come up with a plan?
I think their focus is looking at the needs of their local municipality first. I know a lot of municipalities, I see more commonly cities rather than necessarily towns and villages, coming up with a long-term capital plan where they know over a period of years what type of improvements they need to do. And so if they have already done something like that, they obviously would review it, prioritize it, if you haven't ever done a capital plan, this is now that now you have a great incentive to do one. It will provide a roadmap for not only your at this point in time, but for the future. I think another area that's important in terms of doing the planning is listening to your constituents as to what is important to them. But again, getting back to planning, looking at your infrastructure, looking at your short-term goals versus your long-term goals. Obviously, a capital plan is a long-term goal. Some of the other uses of the funding is more of a short-term focus with regard to replacing revenue. But I personally feel that it's really important to kind of at least have your capital plan no matter what.
Right. And then there are some of these eligible uses that they could like to minimize the negative impacts. There's state programs and there's other federal programs that are already available for like say, rental assistance and things like that. So you should be aware of those and you should be able to direct your constituents to those programs. But that's probably not, especially for our smaller local municipalities, it's probably not the best use of your funds because there's other avenues for people to access that. So you really, I think the two key areas for municipalities to focus on is the infrastructure and the lost revenue. My personal opinion. I don't know, Linda, Jonathan, what you guys
think? Absolutely.
So great job, guys. In respect for some time, we do have a lot of questions this week, as we thought we might, going into some more of the details. So we'll take as many as we can, but we do want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we are going to try to wrap up here by 9:15, but we will have access to be able to email answers to these folks during the week. I think there's some great questions here and some great topics. So we'll get to the most we can, but rest assured we'll get to everybody in one form or another. I think one area that seemed to come up a couple of times in the questions is regarding the low-income census tracts. And you have a little more flexibility right there, Jen, when it comes to uses of funds.
Yes, these qualified census tracts, actually, it's not in the original law. It's something that came out in the regulations that the Treasury did. But it seems like because one of the focuses is on the disproportionately impacted areas. And so these qualified census tracts, if you are doing services or pretty much it's a safe harbor. If you're doing something that affects these qualified census tract areas, you pretty much anything you do there should be okay. It's an allowable use because the idea is that those areas were hardest hit by the pandemic. And so trying to make improvements there will definitely meet the spirit of the rules.
Very, very good. Just looking through a couple here. Could funds be used to replace lost water revenue if people didn't pay off their hookup bills and such?
So the lost revenue is really focusing on the governmental services, not utility services. So that one is probably not really going to fall in there. But yeah, so it's looking at the government as a whole, but not utilities. Everything else but utilities.
Okay. And then we have one here about, can some of these single audit and consulting expenses be paid for out of the ARPA funds?
Linda, I think they can, can't they?
Yes, I believe they make provisions for administrative expenses in the Act, and those types of expenses would be considered administrative. Absolutely.
Okay, and then about the timing of an eligible water and sewer project. If they had a project that kind of was in the works, there's some cutoff dates, I believe, right, as to when the project had to be started and when you can use the funds.
there are dates, and the expenditures had to be done by 2024, and if they obligated them, they had another 2 years. You can't go back and get reimbursement for expenses prior. So I'm not sure if the question is if they've already started and expended money, as opposed to just begun the planning for a particular
planning phase. But if they actually started construction, that probably prior to that date, that project probably wouldn't be eligible.
Right.
Here's one. We previously received coronavirus relief funds. Can we use this money for the same things?
So the coronavirus relief funds, basically, yes, there are just a couple of little carve outs that if you received that money, yes, okay. So there's just two things that now you could have spent it on using the coronavirus relief funds that you can't spend it on now. And one of those is there's been a change in the payrolls for the public health and safety. So that's not going to be calculated exactly the same way. And under the coronavirus relief funds, you could use it to pay for expenses related to tax exempt notes, but that is no longer an eligible use under the current act.
Okay. How do federal procurement requirements differ from what we're already doing?
Well, those the federal procurement requirements are, in some respects, less. I'm going to say have higher bidding thresholds than what in New York State we are accustomed to. However, they have other requirements with regard to minority and women-owned businesses, and in some cases, Davis-Bacon, which is incorporated in some of the New York State Department of Labor regulations. If you're used to getting a single audit, then you would already have the systems in place to comply with federal procurement rules. So the uniform guidance regulations provide a source for those requirements.
But how it's going to affect one municipality versus another, it depends on what your current procurement policies are. If your current procurement policies are really strong, then it might not have as much of an impact as somebody who is not quite as formal and.
Great. Do we have to specifically prove that the revenue loss was due to COVID?
No, actually, this is one of the nice things, is that it's basically assumed that if you lost revenue, it was due to COVID. So that is one of the things that you do not have to document.
Here's one that's a little specific, but I think we can try to take a stab at it. In a rural community where the homes are built quite a bit off the road, are we able to pay for the broadband cost to bring that wiring from the street to the house, which in a lot of times can be in the thousands of dollars range?
They want to expand infrastructure. I don't believe that they're very specific in exactly how, where the costs are, whether you only bring it to the street, do you bring it to the house? I don't see that they provided any of that kind of very specific guidance.
Yeah. Again, I think this would fall in that documentation and it
right.
goes pursuant to your plan to bring broadband to an underserved, or that as long as you document it, it doesn't seem to be excluded.
Right.
And if it's in a qualified census tract area, go for it.
Here's another one. This will be our last question, I believe, so we can kind of wrap up. But can we pay premium pay for work prior to March of 2021?
Actually, yes. The Act generally wants you to just look at things forward, costs from, I believe it's March 3rd, 2021 going forward. However, with the premium pay, that you are actually allowed to go back, because these people were, on the front lines out there working this past year prior to March 3rd. So that is actually allowed. That's one of the few things that you can retroactively go back and do.
Great. Okay. So again, we have a lot of questions. So Linda and I and Jen will get together and try to get a bunch of emails out. We had a very active group this morning, which is great to see, as this topic is very good. And again, I just want to remind everybody that last week's program and this week's program is archived on our website at rbtcpas.com for future reference, or if you have any other folks. We did have a comment in the comments section that they'd like to have their town planner and some others be able to look back on these, so they are there for you to replay. We will be back next week, same time. The next few weeks, we're hoping to have some special guests with us to provide clarity. Next week, we're having Jonathan Drafkin from Patterns for Progress join us on the show to talk about some of the impacts where he believes this is going to be impactful to the community here. So definitely mark your calendars for that one. It'll be again 8:30 next Wednesday. Special thank you goes out to our group here, our IT expert Eric, Aaron, and Tori, who make Linda and I's job a whole lot easier, and our managing partner for supporting us, and our producer Mike Totoro. So with that, you have a great week, everybody, and look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.